This story will tell about the battlefield of werewolves and seemingly ordinary people who were able to visit the most secret corners of the universe. It all started with the murder of a werewolf. Mike looked around and realized that his incredible beast power had allowed him to destroy all the enemies on the battlefield. Their bloody body parts lay everywhere. The hero flared with rage. He remembered that his worst enemy did not lie in this mountain of corpses. He took his steel hammer and began to walk heavily into another dimension, where his once best friend, but now worst enemy, could be hiding. On the way to the portal, Mike noticed the corpse of his mentor, who once helped him learn the rarest techniques, which further motivated him to seek revenge. At one point, it seemed to him that his teacher was breathing, but it turned out to be just an illusion that could only temporarily alleviate his pain. Suddenly, he saw the leg of his worst enemy, who was able to desecrate the teacher's bloody body and tear off his arm. The werewolf rose a little higher and before instantly disappearing managed to show a sign indicating his imminent fate as a mentor. Mike raised his hammer, which was filled with bright energy, and wanted to have time to hit the werewolf's vile and arrogant head. The energy, driven by a strong desire for revenge and the impossibility of realizing this task instantly, changed Mike's facial features beyond recognition. However, the werewolf calmly continued his movement to another dimension, and his cynical smile was etched into the memory of our hero. Despite this, the powerful energy of his hammer brought the werewolf back to the battlefield and struck like lightning at the foot of this monster. At the same time, a bright clot of energy, seething in the form of a ball, emitted by this beast, allowed the werewolf to be instantly hidden in another space. Mike knelt down, his head resting on his hammer, tears of rage and despair streaming down his cheeks. He believed that this was not the last meeting with his enemy. Only the desire for revenge allowed him to move forward. In moments of despair, he often remembered his childhood, the time when he was simply developing and believed in justice in this world, just that happy time. He remembered playing with his older brother Tom, who spoiled him so much and did not spare his time to have fun with his younger brother. But an accident with his brother, who fell off the mountain while playing catch-up, did not allow him to remain in a peaceful state for long. Mike took his hammer and looked at the sky with determination. He knew that he would not back down from his goal. The image of his older brother, which surfaced in his memory, gave him more energy and motivation to complete his planned tasks. He didn't even notice how he found himself on the edge of the abyss and could now see the ruined city, which was destroyed as a result of the battle with the werewolves. The hideous expression of his worst enemy, the glaring pupils of his eyes and long fangs, appeared in the portal between the dimensions of the universe. In the background, one could see his retinue of ghouls, demons, and witches who served him faithfully. Mike leaned over, hugged the hammer like his beloved mother, and quietly cried that in this battle he was still unable to defeat this werewolf Woland. Someone's voice interrupted his thoughts. It caught him off guard, which abruptly pulled him aside, because he did not expect the presence of other people. It was the voice of his dying mentor, asking Mike to come closer to deliver his final request. He saw how part of the werewolf's arm was sticking out of his teacher's chest. From the sharp pain he could hardly speak. He was losing consciousness. But the desire to say goodbye to Mike brought him back to his senses. The teacher said that he did not give Mike his most secret and powerful weapon, capable of destroying any werewolf, even that same Woland. The hero became wary because the teacher had always been completely open with him, and he was sure that he knew everything that the mentor knew. The teacher pointed to the ring on his right index finger, which was shimmering with bright energy. It would allow him to remember all the circumstances of his childhood and give him full strength. Having put the said ring on his finger, Mike felt an unprecedented surge of energy, which emanated from his hands in bright colors. In an instant, his consciousness became clouded. He saw himself as a small and sick boy, lying on a bed in a nearly dying state. His mother was sobbing loudly over his body and could not raise her head. Our hero, exhausted from weakness, opened his eyes and began to say goodbye to his mother and asked her not to cry bitterly about his inevitable death, because there was no money for the medicines that would help him recover. After these words, the mother fell into even greater despair and could not hide her tears, sobbing loudly that she could not help her beloved youngest son in any way. She remembered those horrible owners of the apartment who had beaten her and her son the day before, just because they had been framed for stealing at a food market. At that very moment, two of those impudent men burst into their room and demanded that they leave the premises, since they did not want to live next door to thieves. One of the thugs suddenly pushed the chair on which Mike's mother was sitting with his powerful leg, shouting to get out of this house. From the blow, she hit her head hard, which did not allow her to resist, and only whispered that they were accused of theft because of her unwillingness to have intimate relations with the owner of the market. Her lifeless body was dragged around the room by two louts like trash that they wanted to get rid of immediately. Begging for mercy was useless. Mike was convulsing from his helplessness and inability to help his mother. His face was filled with anger and fury, but his body could not move, which shocked him even more. His hands began to tremble and fill with blood. His skin began to burst and wild pain pierced his entire body. He did not understand what was happening to him. At one moment, the fist of the palm was covered with a bright glow, which poured unprecedented strength into his body. Now he understood when he first felt his supernatural abilities. Mike was able to calm down and control the movements of his hands. He had never felt so strong before, which gave him a sense of confidence and the ability to protect the person closest to him. He raised his hands high above his head, and a bright beam of light illuminated the room, as if the sun had set in this room, which took the furious giants by surprise. They left the body of their mother and froze in horror at what they saw. Our hero leaned towards his mother. The big guys asked not to touch them, clenching his hands in fear. The first one begged for mercy, and the second one even fell to his knees and began to sob loudly from fear. He looked at his mother's face. She wasn't breathing. Mike couldn't believe that these bastards took her life. The hero knelt for a long time before his mother's motionless body. His hands continued to emanate energy. Now he remembered what had happened on that fateful day. Who was to blame for the death, and the thirst for revenge awakened in him with unprecedented power, after which, vivid moments of serious battles were carried through his memory, in which he sent his ancestors to the world with one blow of his sword. The blood of enemies on his sword and face testified to the most difficult battles. With one blow of the sword, they chopped off the bodies of their opponents. Blood burst out in a powerful stream in different directions. Cries of pain and horror rushed through space. Mike suddenly woke up. His comrade in arms was already standing next to him, his eyes filled with imminent death as the werewolf returned to continue the fight. Wolin's eyes emitted a bright white light. His fangs flashed like lightning, and with his whole body he showed his determination to finally finish off Mike. The hero understood that now their forces were not equal. He had not yet had time to recover from the last battle, but he abruptly pulled the sword to the side and accepted the fight, not trying to hide in another dimension. Mike's bloody sword and clothes showed that his wounds had not yet healed, and it would be difficult for him to win, maybe even impossible. But he could not show even a hint of hesitation. He simply jumped up and charged straight at the werewolf, aware of the fact that he could die from a close-range strike. But it would allow him to win, even at the cost of his own life. The sword pierced the werewolf's body, hitting him right in the heart. From the said fatal blow, he turned into an ordinary man and fell lifeless in an unnatural pose next to the bodies of the other opponents. His head, torn off by a powerful blow, fell down. A powerful roar rushed through the air, filling the space with a shockwave. At the same time, Mike's body with a severed arm fell into the abyss. He managed to deliver a fatal blow at the cost of his life. His eyes had not yet closed, and it seemed that he should remain alive. But the blood flowing from his mouth gave no hope for recovery. Suddenly, he felt the power, turned on his back and took a deep breath. Took a full chest of air and small goosebumps penetrated his whole body. The arm began to recover quickly. Fractures and abrasions healed instantly. Mike looked at his hands in surprise, because only recently he was dying. His second hand was torn off. The hero realized that he had gained immortality, but for which he would have to pay dearly with his freedom. His otherworldly brothers in arms were already standing next to him, since by putting on the teacher's ring, he had made a pact with the devil. But why the teacher had decided to give him his life, Mike did not understand. The hero saw the rest of his retinue in the form of demons, dogs, and skeletons, who greeted their new master. Also with him were his former comrades in arms, Mark and Jessica. They were still in the form of ordinary people. Mike realized that they had been servants of his teacher before. The portal between dimensions began to play with light. All this indicated that it was necessary to proceed into it, which seemed alien and strange to Mike. Mark assured our hero that he needed to go to the other world. Only there he would complete his inauguration ceremony, and would always be by his side and would never betray him. Mike reached out towards the portal and suddenly found himself in the most terrifying place imaginable. The moving hands of his fallen enemies were sticking out of the burning lava, begging for mercy. The hero entered the lava and recognized individual hands of defeated enemies, werewolves, who had caused so much trouble and spent a lot of time searching for and destroying them. Then he sat down on his throne. His body became like a skeleton dressed in outerwear. Next to him, like a faithful dog, was a small skeleton. Mike realized his belonging to the otherworldly forces, which greatly excited him. The High Priest, a former monk who in the indicated dimension played the role of chief procurator and advisor to the ruler of the afterlife dimension, approached the throne. Bowing low, the High Priest offered Mike his friendship and assured him of his loyal service to his new master. At the same time, his red eyes radiated anger, because he had been waiting for this position for almost 500 years. Mike, having listened calmly spoke words that should have shocked the High Priest, but he simply grinned, making it clear that his master was still very small and stupid in comparison to him. Mike became angry at the audacity shown. His new and unstoppable power began to manifest itself around his body, and it seemed that just a little more and he would allow himself to strike him the first blow. But suddenly he realized that he was in this dimension to cleanse himself and gain new knowledge that would help him successfully fight werewolves. The High Priest was glad. His new master had passed the first test, and his successful training in new secret powers could be guaranteed. He saw Mike rise from his throne and walk into the crystal room where the most beautiful and successful inhabitants of this dimension usually rested. Our hero, entering the indicated hall, was surprised to see his reflection. This man looked very much like him, but for some reason he simply stood there and repeated all his movements. Mike, using a small clot of his energy, struck his so-called reflection in the chest area, from which the unknown person fell to the floor. They were vampires. One of them showed his bloody hand and affirmatively explained that this was only the tip of the iceberg that he was about to get to know, and that man was his second self. His second consciousness lay motionless on the ground. Mike did not understand what to do and who to listen to, since he found himself in a completely unfamiliar environment, which worried him greatly. The hero returned to his throne and thought for a long time about why he had been given such a fate and what awaited him in the future. But the new memories and knowledge he had received allowed him to live on and look for those responsible for his mother's death. His solitude was disturbed by his new friends, strong guys, and a young, beautiful girl who invited him to have dinner together. The High Priest assured him that he shouldn't waste the allotted time on entertainment, that he should acquire new knowledge and immediately head to the local library. But the pretty girl didn't give our hero any peace. He objected to his advisor's opinion and went to his new cheerful comrades, and the boring High Priest only muttered words of indignation that in his youth they did not allow their elders to be insolent. Mike heard everything and cut off the advisor's words, pointing out that he is the master in this dimension, and it is up to him to decide how to spend his time and what to do. The advisor meekly apologized but harbored a strong grudge. Perhaps it would backfire on our hero and play a cruel joke on him. Although he muttered to himself that this guy was just like his father. The hero himself wanted to apologize to the old and wise advisor, but he made it clear that he understood everything and agreed with his arguments. On his way out of the room, he saw his friend Mark standing near the portal. He intended to immediately move to another dimension. Mike was confused by his actions. Did he really want to leave the other world without warning him, so to speak? Mark said that he received an urgent message about the impending danger in the earthly dimension, that he was not going to leave it. But werewolves were able to penetrate people and there was no time for sentimentality. They hugged each other, as before, like true friends, because they had known each other since childhood and had not been offended by each other for a long time. Mike promised to follow him as soon as possible. As a parting word, he whispered in his ear that Mark should take care of himself and risk his life. Only our hero is immortal, and he did not want to lose his loyal friend. Literally some time later, our hero, accompanied by his advisor, stood in front of the portal and went to earthly civilization to provide assistance and destroy werewolves. He came closer to the portal. For a moment he wanted to stay a little longer in this dimension. He understood that yesterday he was the most ordinary person and his life had changed so dramatically. He touched his hands. They were in place. The hero could not believe that after the last battle with the werewolf he managed to survive, and not only that but become even better. He again sadly remembered his teacher. At one point, he found himself on a crowded Washington street, with his comrades in arms and a ghost from the other world named Teddy nearby. They were all determined to fight werewolves. Mike saw a large multi-story building with huge glass windows, in which, according to information, werewolves could be located. In the lobby of the building, he saw two young girls. They were quietly laughing. Mike did not understand what caused their ridicule. He looked at himself in the mirror and realized that he had appeared in this dimension dressed as the Lord of the Underworld. The hero hoped that they would think that he had just come from a carnival, or was just a funny guy. The hero walked decisively to the elevator to go up to the director's office. Near the elevator, a company employee looked at him in surprise. Of course, his appearance leaves much to be desired. Entering the reception area, he was met by attractive girls who, before the interview, suggested that he undergo a medical examination. Being a drug addict was not acceptable in their company. As soon as he sat down on the chair, Mike was immediately given a syringe and his blood was drawn. It happened so quickly that our hero didn't come to his senses. The girls joyfully exclaimed that the tests were passed. The hero could proceed to another room to perform other tests. The hero thought for a moment that it would be better to fight on the battlefield than to endure this torment. He imagined himself in this room as a little boy in a skeleton costume, closely watched by an adult warden. He was reassured that these humiliations would be followed by success in catching a werewolf. In the next office, he was met by a noisy guy who laughed loudly and asked him to follow him. He put his arm around his back and asked him not to contradict his boss. He is famous for his bad temper and loves rank worship and unquestioning obedience. Entering the office, he found himself alone. On the chair lay a decent suit and shirt that suited our hero. He realized that he was simply not recognized in this suit, again remembered his advisor and mentally thanked him for this combination. Outside the door, he heard the voices of his young accounting workers, who were heatedly discussing the arrival of a strange gentleman in a skeleton costume into the building. Oddly enough, the suit fit perfectly, as if it had been custom-made by a tailor. At that moment, Mike realized that he was in the body of the company's director. He began to read the current documentation, but did not understand anything about the type of activity of this company. Some deliveries, orders, tender documentation. Mike was horrified, and what if he really had to manage the team? He gave the undelivered mail to his secretary in the hope that she would figure out which departments to forward it to for fulfillment. But still, how wonderful it is to feel like a big leader. And our hero straightened up and straightened his shoulders in admiration. A subordinate entered the office, and from the manner of his communication, our hero understood that it must be his deputy. He wondered what to do if he had to address him by his first name and patronymic. Without starting with the usual pleasantries, Mike simply demanded a report on the company's key financial and production indicators. In bewilderment, his deputy took a small key and a small piece of paper with handwritten text from his pocket and froze in anticipation. Mike turned his back so as not to show his excitement with his facial expressions. He didn't know what the real director of the company could ask for and why they showed him this key. He was on the verge of deciphering it. In order not to be completely deciphered, our hero immediately took the key, went out onto the balcony and did not wait for comments on his inappropriate behavior from his deputy. He walked along the balcony railings for a long time and did not understand what to do, how to contact his team, where they had disappeared to, and why they had not agreed on the date and place of the next meeting. But our hero would not have possessed supernatural abilities. As a result of short reasoning, he noticed the presence of his team in the area of the company building. He looked intently at the multi-story building opposite. In some windows, the lights were already on, which was a conventional sign for a safe meeting. You can move into the room. Mike, using his abilities, instantly moved to a cozy and warm room with large vases on the shelves. Walking around the room, he found a stack of sheets of paper that should contain information that would help find the werewolves. The hero sat down on the sofa and began to read carefully. Among the sheets of paper, he found old photographs. He understood who could have made them and taken a photograph of the people depicted on the photograph. The hero definitely came to the conclusion that those guys were photographed by his old and damned enemy Wooland, which means the guys depicted in it are werewolves. He especially recognized these two young guys as particularly dangerous werewolves who had already managed to destroy many of his comrades in arms. The hero was confused. Shifting sheets of paper from hand to hand, he did not know in which direction to begin the search activities. His eyes were bloodshot. He remembered exactly where he could have seen those guys before. They were the ones involved in the murder of his mother. On the top corner of the sheet of paper, he found a secret sign of the Department of the Masonic Society, specializing in the search for werewolves, which meant he was on the right track. Mike was already moving in the car, his eyes still glowing red with anger and anticipation of locating the particularly dangerous werewolves. He went to the nearest large supermarket, where he showed a photograph of the wanted werewolves. They could have been seen in this place. The administrator began checking the video recordings of the outdoor surveillance cameras, as well as the lists of buyers. However, the guys in question were not identified. Mike was disappointed, as if his hands had dropped, because he had so hoped to find them here, because the discovered sheets of paper indicated to start the search from the specified supermarket. He left the store and questioned regular customers of the store who might have the information he was looking for. but his hopes were not met. While thinking about further directions of work and the need to quickly detain the werewolves, Mike did not notice how he walked into the underground passage. At the end of the stairs, he saw police tape that marks the scene of a crime. Had he not managed to save people's lives? He lifted the tape and walked forward to the scene, wanting only to see nothing terrible. The police officers abruptly demanded that he stop driving and show his identification, as well as the reason for his appearance at the specified location. Mike understood that he could be detained on suspicion of committing a crime and, without waiting for a negative scenario for him, decided to use his supernatural abilities. The hero opened a portal between dimensions and decided to get out of this underground passage at any cost, and also find out the location of the werewolves from his advisor. The portal could not fully open for a long time, which did not play in our hero's favor. A little more, and he will be detained. He concentrated all his strength and energy, which allowed him to open the portal to the required size. This time, the evil policeman would not be able to stop him. There was a huge burst of energy and a loud bang. Mike instantly disappeared as if it was just a mirage. The policeman was shocked by what he saw because no one would believe his report. They would take him for a madman if he reported what he saw. In an instant, the policeman wanted to follow Mike, but as soon as he touched the borders of the portal, he felt severe pain. At the same time, Mike could be seen calmly walking further along the portal, as if entering a passing subway car. Other subway workers, surprised by what they saw, began to actively discuss what had happened. Clots of energy continued to sparkle with bright light in the room. At the same time, the portal tunnel began to change color, which led to an uncontrolled movement into the dimension of dead werewolves. Near the entrance to the throne room of the king of the dead werewolves, a werewolf he had recently killed in the burning city where he had last seen his teacher was sadly awaiting his fate. Our hero thought that moving to the specified dimension would allow him to track down the wanted werewolves involved in the death of his mother. Near the throne room, he discovered a large skeleton of a bull, similar in appearance to the previously killed his worst enemy and werewolf named Woland. Next to this pile of bones, he saw the skull of a trophy deer, which emitted strange sounds similar to the wild roar of a tiger. Mike, without waiting for the horns to hurt him, decided to use his energy and directed it towards the skull. The skull, shrouded in a bright glow, stopped emitting strange sounds, and a viscous liquid resembling jelly began to flow from its cavities. The hero continued to direct his energy in different directions, causing the skeletons in it to fly apart into tiny bones. The dead werewolves present begged Mike for mercy and assured him to stop mocking him and trying to scare him. The retinue of the chief werewolf of the world of the dead obediently escorted our hero to the chamber of their ruler, not raising their skulls out of shame in front of our hero. Mike climbed the stairs and saw a long corridor equipped with steel bars to prevent the free movement of the inhabitants of this dimension. Strange sounds were heard. The hero saw how an unknown guy cut the horse's body with one blow of his sword, blood splashed in all directions, and that guy, like a maniac, enjoyed causing pain to the animal. His terrible, insane yellow eyes radiated only one desire: murder, murder, and death to all living things. He was simply the spawn of hell. The main villain of this dimension and his submissive and devoted comrades, the same maniacs as their boss, gathered in a circle around the body of the dead horse. The dead werewolves became wary and began to talk indignantly with Mike, making claims against him because of his unexpected visit to their chambers. The main one demanded that they apologize to them, and also demonstratively took a sword in his hands and began to threaten to take their lives, after which they began to mockingly discuss the uninvited guest among themselves, and ironically suggested eating the hooves of the killed horse so that they would forgive him for this visit. They continued to laugh loudly, expecting a cowardly reaction from our hero, who would ask for mercy and apologize to them. The main werewolf even offered to become his servant, who would wash his socks and carry his heavy sword for him. If he agreed, they would simply spit on his back and not hurt him. One after another, they continued to pour out even more caustic and mocking suggestions for Mike to keep him healthy, even suggesting that he take off his pants and bend over to please him. After these clearly unconstructive proposals, as well as the silence of our hero, the main werewolf simply began to revel in his superiority. Only one young werewolf suggested calming down and continuing the conversation in a friendly atmosphere. They accused him of being weak and not worthy of being with them, and these words made the werewolves want to humiliate their comrade and kick him out of their company. The main werewolf was encouraged and even suggested beating them together, then cutting their bodies with swords like that horse, and then playing American football with their heads. First, they decided to beat and humiliate their comrade, who, in their opinion, was a weakling. The leader stepped on his head with his foot, Then, they started discussing how they would humiliate him. They suggested pouring urine or horse feces on him. They said that he wasn't even worthy of being beaten. One of the werewolves suggested that they arrange a show fight between their weakling and this uninvited guest in order to have a lot of fun. The boss replied that it was a good idea, and his right hand, as always, was on top of things and offered the most creative ideas. Another of his close comrades suggested that they should additionally be doused with horse feces and then have a fight between them to the death. The main werewolf even lit a cigarette in anticipation of a good show and gave the command to carry out the planned actions. Mike calmly began to assure everyone that if they did not stop their crazy pranks, they would have to greatly regret that they could still continue to breathe. A strong verbal conflict began between them, which escalated into a fight, or rather, into our hero beating up these smug werewolves. The very first blow to the jaw area was received by the main werewolf, from which he began to bleed, and he sank to his extreme point. The most benevolent of them, the werewolf, perked up at what he saw. He realized that Mike could help him avoid humiliation. Our hero was surrounded from the sides and from behind by the rest of the werewolves, preparing to deal him a crushing defeat in a fight. Then, without moving his hands, Mike struck the most daring werewolf of them with a beam of his energy, who simply flew away like a ball. From the powerful blow to the chest area, blood burst out of all natural openings, mouth, nostrils, and ears. He had never experienced such severe pain. Our hero calmly put his hands in his trouser pockets, letting them know that if the fight continued, the same fate awaited them all. But this only made the other werewolves even more angry. They took out all their weapons and continued to advance with animal cries. Mike decided to use his supernatural power since they were superior in numbers. One thing reassured him that in this dimension they could no longer take the form of a beast. Realizing that now was the right time to get rid of the daring werewolves, the old skeleton servant sided with Mike and began to help in the destruction of these brave werewolves. The blows came one after another, the swords breaking bones and tearing out chunks of flesh. The enraged skeletons fought desperately with the young werewolves. During the fight, the skeletons joyfully showed off their battle trophies in the form of the bodies of the daring werewolves they had sent into oblivion, raised on spears. They continued to fight until the last werewolf was gone, which further terrified the young, decent werewolf who tried to stand up for Mike. Finally, the skeletons killed the main werewolf, who had mocked them for so many years and did not respect their venerable age. At this time, the decent werewolf realized that he had only a few seconds left to live, although he never shared the vicious behavior of his friends. Mike stopped the skeletons and with his red-as-fire eyes commanded them to stop killing him. Took him under his protection, since the day before he stood up for him. The young werewolf said that his name was Johnny, and he was very grateful for his rescue, ready to repay him with faithful service. Mike said that he is the worst enemy of the werewolves, with whom he has been waging a long-standing war. He has personal reasons for hating them, and he protected him simply out of kindness, but is already ready to change his mind. Johnny was sobbing with fear and begging for his life. He assured that he would reveal all the secrets of the werewolves, their places of residence and connections, if our hero took him with him. Mike almost left and wanted to leave this werewolf to be torn apart by skeletons, but the desire to find his mother's killers led him to rationality, and he decided to save the life of this werewolf. The portal began to appear again in the subway. The workers, amazed by what they saw, could not believe their own eyes. They asked each other to pinch their bodies to disprove the state of sleep. Our hero emerged from the portal into the earthly dimension together with his new werewolf friend, who, as soon as he heals his wounds, will help him find other werewolves. Johnny shouted slogans that there would be no mercy for other werewolves and he would never betray his new master. Mike now understood why the portal had brought dead werewolves into his dimension, namely for the purpose of finding an assistant in the search for especially dangerous werewolves threatening all of humanity. Realizing that Johnny was completely under our hero's control, he decided to demonstrate his abilities to him. A bright ball lit up in his palm. The young werewolf Johnny realized that his new master had supernatural powers and therefore was not afraid of his former comrades. He became very afraid for his second life. His thoughts were interrupted by a police officer who demanded that he show his identity card, registration, or work permit. They began to explain to Johnny his rights when he was detained. His right to a lawyer, since he could not even give his name and place of birth, because no one would believe that he was born 500 years ago. The police were relentless and demanded that he immediately explain the purpose of his presence in the subway and why he was on the street without documents. They began monotonously finishing reading his rights and responsibilities, preparing to use physical force to detain him and take him to the police station. Our hero realized that it was time to intervene in their conversation and distract their attention. He did not want to harm the Guardians of Order because they, like him, fight evil. Mike decided to distract their attention by opening a portal to the other worlds. After seeing this, they should completely forget the events of this day. He emerged from the underground passage and had a vision that the hiding werewolves were now in a large, beautiful, multi-story building in Manhattan. What we saw pierced our hero with a sharp pain. His eyes became bloodshot. He only wanted quick revenge in the capture of these villains. He returned to the policemen. They stood and muttered the same phrases. They couldn't even move, and their eyes simply disappeared from their faces. Johnny hid behind our hero's powerful back and followed him out into the street. He repeated several times that he would definitely be useful to our hero. On the way, they saw a local famous nightclub, where, according to Johnny, werewolves used to often relax in the company of beautiful girls and their friends. They thought for a long time what to do, immediately moved to Manhattan. But they could not fail to catch those werewolves from clairvoyance or try to find other monsters in this club. Suddenly, Johnny started laughing loudly, almost to bursting. He couldn't calm down even for a minute. It seemed like he would burst from laughter. Mike began to worry about what was happening to him. He was simply confused about what to do next and how to help his new companion. Johnny froze, wiped away a tear, and said that in the distant past, on this very street, he was bitten by a werewolf, which completely changed his life. After which he walked joyfully towards the front entrance of the nightclub. He perked up again and seemed to have completely forgotten his grief. They stopped at the entrance, bought tickets, and discussed that this nightclub was a hotbed of evil and debauchery, and that they needed to stick together. When they entered the dance hall, loud music was playing. Someone was listening to Elvis Presley. They could not understand what style of music was typical for this club. There were only men around. They thought that the girls might come a little later. But most likely this nightclub is for lovers of male love. They decided to leave the dance floor and walk through the service areas, hoping to find the werewolves. Johnny smelled his former comrades behind a closed door. The entrance to the said room was guarded by a daring and young security guard, who looked at them arrogantly in the eyes and indicated with his body position that they would not be able to go further. The angry security guard menacingly inquired about the purpose of the visit, began to check their names against the list of invited guests, and asked to present supporting documents. Johnny was confused and started to come up with various excuses why they couldn't show their IDs right now, that they were forgotten in the limousine, or maybe the maid washed them. The guard became wary. Mike realized that he had to take the initiative into his own hands and continued the conversation. He explained that Mr. Mouse was waiting for them. Everyone in this city knew him. Therefore, there was no doubt that he was really waiting for them. The guard realized that Mr. Mouse was a frequent guest at their establishment, but today he was absent, as he had gone with his mistress to Italy to sunbathe by the sea. The strict guard couldn't stand the deception and began to furiously threaten our hero and his friend that he would immediately call the police to take them to the station. But in general, they were lucky that he didn't start beating them right there. With a sharp movement of his hand, he indicated the direction they should go, that their place was at the station with the homeless. How dare they show up at this club? Mike stood there cold-bloodedly and didn't even react to his threats. So the guard just went berserk and started moving around chaotically and waving his arms. Mike, in the same calm intonation, said the magic words, from which the guard immediately began to obey our heroes and apologized for his indecent behavior. The security guard opened the door as if under a spell and, like a faithful servant, even tried to offer services for delivering luggage and cleaning the hotel room. Mike proudly stepped over the threshold of the doorway and entered the lair of his sworn enemies. Johnny was shaking with fear. He understood that if his former comrades realized that he had gone over to the side of people, then perhaps this would be his last day of life. Mike realized that in this room there were simply children of rich parents who, due to their lifestyle and thoughts, were on the verge of turning into werewolves. The main guy in this group of guys was watching our heroes closely. He was tormented by the question of how they got past security. Or maybe they were couriers who were supposed to deliver pizza. All 5 young, rich, and daring guys stared at Mike and his shaking Johnny. They were all surprised who they were and why they came, since this was a closed area for everyone. The main major threatened those present that our heroes had disturbed their fun time. They were expecting call girls, but these were some boys. One of the rich kids asked for a cocktail and, holding a large wad of money in his hands, offered them to sing a song for them or kiss each other for that amount. Mike was angered by this insolent mockery, and he pointed out that everyone present here was not worth a dime compared to him. His next move would be to beat up everyone present. The group of guys panicked, because no one had ever dared to talk to them, They were used to being worshipped and having their every whim fulfilled. They screamed in fear and squealed in excitement like little girls, asking our hero for forgiveness. To smooth things over, the eldest of the group introduced himself and explained that his name was Billy, and that his friends did not want to offend them. Billy extended his hand to our hero and assured them that no harm would come to them in this company, that Mike was a real man, and that no one had ever given them such a rebuff. They shook hands firmly and went to sit down at the table to discuss the reasons for their appearance in this club, the possible help they needed. Billy sternly asked the guy who had previously been rude to his guest to leave the room, or better yet, go home. The guy stood up from the sofa and, looking guilty, was about to leave the company. He felt very ashamed of the words he had said earlier. Mike stopped him and asked Billy not to scold his friend since anything could happen, and he was not offended by him in this whole company. Bill happily hugged our hero, realizing that the conflict was over and they could relax. Nothing was threatening them anymore. Bill suggested having a bottle of whiskey and then having some fun with the girls who were about to come to them. Mike didn't like this proposal. He pointed out that such leisure is typical for people who are on the edge of their morality. A little more drugs will go, and then your appearance will completely change. Bill guiltily agreed with our hero. He did not expect such a reaction from our hero and simply offered to have a cup of coffee. Everyone sat down at the table and began to discuss their sudden appearance, since their guard had never let anyone in without prior consent. Having gained a little courage, Billy nevertheless suggested drinking a glass of whiskey to celebrate their acquaintance and also to chat more closely. Mike was wary, which meant closer. Maybe they were homosexuals and weren't expecting any girls, but he calmed down and approved the proposal. Bill happily began to open alcoholic drinks and tell them that they always have fun in this establishment, but strange things happen here from time to time. Mike was interested in these words, since his new friend Johnny's instincts should not have deceived him, and most likely real werewolves appear here from time to time. Billy began to tell that young girls sometimes disappear from this club. The police can't do anything, so lately it's mostly guys who hang out here. Each of those present began to tell heartbreaking stories about the disappearance of young girls who simply came in to dance. One of the guys started blaming his friend for the disappearance of girls from the club, and all these stories are just fairy tales for adults. They almost started fighting. At the same time, they blamed the guy Billy tried to throw out of the building the day before for the disappearance of the girls. He grabbed him by the ear and hit him on the back of the head, even wanted to knock him to the floor and continue beating him with his feet. Billy ordered them to calm down and sit down at the table. His guilt in the disappearances has not been proven. It is all speculation, and it must be thoroughly investigated. He hugged him and said that he would not allow others to offend his younger brother, and that these incidents must be dealt with, but no one knows how. The boy was still shaking with fear, and Billy assured him that if anyone touched his brother again, they would deal with him immediately. Billy spoke in detail about the disappearance of at least 50 girls, and his brother is suspected, since one of them saw his brother on the dance floor the day before her disappearance, and feelings arose between them. His younger brother couldn't take it anymore and started crying because he loved Katie, the name of the missing girl, very much. Mike realized that this was all the work of werewolves, who used to come to this nightclub very often. Suddenly, the fight between those guys took a new turn. They started to strangle each other, shouting that he loved Katie too. Billy shouted loudly and demanded that this outrage stop, as it did not bring respect to our company in the eyes of the guests. His younger brother wiped away his tears and started running towards Mike, his appearance indicating that he wanted to ask something or share information. He ran up to our hero and began to assure him that he had nothing to do with the disappearance of that girl, that these were all malicious speculations that were not supported by anything. Billy's brother said that the last time he saw her was behind the beautiful pink door of this club, but she did not let him in, but asked him to wait in the corridor. After that, no one saw her. Bill himself continued to angrily scold his friend, who constantly pestered his younger brother without reason. That guy tried to make excuses. The others also started to support him and assure him that his brother had seen Katie for the last time and that he was especially responsible. Billy lit a cigarette and assured that he would find whoever was involved in the disappearance of that girl. Then everyone would understand that his brother was not involved. After these words, his comrades secretly began to laugh at him. What wouldn't you do to save your own brother from reprisal, even though he was guilty of her disappearance and perhaps even murder? Billy began calling a private detective he knew to conduct his own investigation and identify the culprit involved in Katie's disappearance. During the call, Mike interrupted him and promised to find this villain himself, especially since he knew that these would be the same werewolves who had once killed his mother. Billy offered to help our hero, but they refused. which made him smoke again and start thinking about which direction to start searching. At the same time, Billy persuaded our hero to at least take his car. Half a minute later, Mike and Johnny were already standing next to Billy's new and cool car. Our hero thought that even though they hadn't found any werewolves in the club, they had gotten new information and a fast car. They looked high into the sky, which was darker than usual, meaning that there would be victims again that night. Werewolves would go hunting. Johnny began to remember where they usually had fun in their past life with their comrades. He listed many places where they usually went, but a lot of time had passed since then. He thought that Mike couldn't hear him and even raised his voice, starting to worry that our hero was thinking that he too had once harmed defenseless women and children. Mike ignored him and walked closer to the front door of the nearby building, which had previously been used as a cafeteria. Johnny began to ask our hero to stop, as he felt danger approaching and suggested that he go into the specified room first. He quickly overtook Mike and opened the door. Even our hero didn't know what awaited him there, but perhaps Johnny was risking his life for our hero. Entering the room and opening the next door, he saw a group of guys who were looking through the CCTV footage. The leader of them shouted to the others to calm down a bit and not make noise as they could be noticed. Johnny realized that they were werewolves, but they were his former friends. They realized that someone was standing behind the door and went to it. Johnny ran out into the street. He did not find Mike. While Johnny was surrounded by werewolves, Mike went into the neighboring building, and he decided to go there, at the same time hiding from his former comrades, whom he did not want to give up to Mike. At this time, Mike was speaking to local students as a lecturer, explaining the basics of theology, as well as certain aspects of parallel worlds. He brought the microphone closer to his mouth and noted that he was about to deliver a very important message to the students. The hall buzzed with anticipation. Mike reported that recently, young girls have started disappearing frequently in Washington nightclubs, which is primarily due to otherworldly forces. He asked to write down his contact number for information. The students were horrified by the information and began to wonder if the police had really never found any of the missing girls. And maybe werewolves were involved. Mike continued his information and indicated that he was an experienced werewolf hunter and asked to report any suspicious things. The students in the back rows even woke up from what they heard and began to discuss our hero in a negative light, saying that he was simply crazy. One of them stood up and even commented on Mike's speech, saying that it was all nonsense and fiction, a sick fantasy of the lecturer, since there are no werewolves. Mike continued to insist on his performance because he wanted to save at least a few more innocent souls. He noticed that the students were outraged and began to disperse. He realized that he had to show his supernatural abilities, otherwise they would take him for a madman. He calmly tapped the microphone with his hand and asked you to prepare for a session of extraordinary magic that will completely dispel your doubts about my veracity. Suddenly, everyone had glowing stones in their hands. Some were speechless from surprise, and their facial expressions froze in one position. Mike clenched his fist tightly around his rock, which shattered into tiny pieces and lit up the room like a powerful light bulb. At the same time, all the students' stones lit up like bright candles and lanterns. They gave off heat, but did not burn their hands. It was real magic. Mike confidently said to himself that now no one would doubt his supernatural abilities, and maybe he would even be able to save the lives of these young people. After which Mike left the hall and, together with Johnny, headed towards the exit to continue their investigation and get on the trail of the werewolf killers. An angry and sloppy guy came out to meet them. It was an old acquaintance of Johnny's who had finally found him in the neighboring building. Frowning, he stopped our heroes, touched his pistol holster with his hand, making it clear that he was ready for decisive action. Johnny trembled with fear. Did he really remember him? And would he have to justify himself to Mike why he didn't immediately tell him about the werewolves in the neighboring building? The werewolf lit a cigarette with a grin and suggested that Johnny follow him himself so as not to hurt his comrade. Mike's eyes turned red. He recognized this guy as a werewolf and wanted to kill him right there and then. But he needed information about their leaders who were involved in the murder of his mother and all those unfortunate girls. The werewolf continued to mockingly communicate with our heroes in the same manner and shout offensive words at them. Mike asked Johnny to turn his back to him so he could discuss their next steps to help them apprehend the guy without making too much noise. After discussing the details, our hero said that he knew about his belonging to werewolves. This information brought him into a stupor. A cold sweat from fear appeared on his face. The werewolf realized that his affiliation with otherworldly forces had been deciphered and he had no choice but to use a firearm. Mike immediately calmed the werewolf down, explaining that one careless move and his brains would be hanging on the walls and lampposts. The ghoul nervously lit a cigarette. He realized that our hero was not just a man, but a werewolf bounty hunter. He decided to take a pause and lit a cigarette. Then he became inspired again, and with the most vivid and negative emotions and words, he pointed out that our guys had only a few seconds left to live. Mike was still cool and didn't feel even a drop of excitement or fear. It all became clear why this little werewolf had become so bold, since the rest of the company of his brothers in mind had come to his aid. This werewolf even began to dance with joy, anticipating the feeling of his victory and the death of our characters. Mike called for help from his new and loyal servants, the skeletons from the dimension of dead werewolves, who remained very grateful to him in connection with their deliverance from the company of Johnny's impudent friends. A terrible fear and a premonition of imminent death, the end of their permissiveness in the world of people, appeared in the faces and eyes of the werewolves. That impudent werewolf saw how his friends died one by one, moaning in pain and crying like children, begging for mercy. He stood in front of the killer skeletons and didn't even try to run away. He decided to kill them with shots from his magic parabellum pistol. He took out his weapon and fired one aimed shot in the hopes of killing at least one of our hero's skeletons. The bullet entered the eye hole and exited without causing any significant harm to Mike's loyal fighters. Then the skeleton delivered a stunning blow with a silver sword, the touch of which would kill any werewolf. But he managed to dodge. Despite these decisive actions, the werewolf did not lose control of his emotions and, gathering his strength into a fist, fired aimed shots into the skull of our skeleton, from which he died. He watched with delight as the skull shattered into tiny pieces, after which he miraculously moved to the other side of the room, and it seemed that he would be able to escape unharmed from our heroes. He noticed the front door, a distance of no more than 5 meters, separated him from the opportunity to find himself free and once again prove his invulnerability. At the same time, another skeleton entered into a terrible battle with him, which dealt several blows to the head area with its steel bones. The werewolf fell, but found the strength to rise and continue his shameful flight. But he was not thinking about his reputation now, but was trying to save his skin by any means necessary. He took out his pistol again and fired in different directions, hoping for a random hit. But the bullets tend to run out. The werewolf received a crushing blow to the torso area, from which his body flew like a feather to the end of the room. However, he did not want to give up and again rose to his knees, clutched his pistol in his hands, and with a bestial grin met the skeletons for a fight to the death. One of the skeletons pounced on this werewolf like a bear and knocked him to the ground. He was not afraid that he managed to reload the magazine and then fired deadly shots. However, the skeleton was able to hit the werewolf with his sword, and a bright bloody spot appeared at the place of the blow. From the wild pain, the werewolf dropped the bloody pistol, which had previously killed and tortured a huge number of innocent souls. He lay on the floor, reaching for his gun, but it seemed that everything was over. All that was left was to plunge the sword into his chest and rip out his lousy heart. However, he found the strength in himself and fired several times towards the skeletons. They did not expect that he would find the strength in himself to do these things, after which he began to slowly pull the sword out of his shoulder, screaming with a wild cry that frightened even the skeletons who had seen the torments of hell. The werewolf threw the sword away from himself with a sharp movement of his hand, showing with his actions that he was ready to continue the fight. An unknown force appeared within him, which gave him a new influx of energy, and he began to shoot at the skeletons without restraint. The clots of energy allowed him to move, violating all the laws of physics and gravity. The shot of cartridges and the flight of bullets were accompanied by a bright glow, which instilled even more horror in the skeletons. One of the skeletons was fatally struck by this beam of energy and fell dead to the floor, something his companions did not expect. Then the werewolf suddenly fell like a stone, but the streams of energy scattered everyone to different corners of the room. He stood up again and began to heal his wound like an animal, shouting and cursing even at his remaining friends. All the skeletons simultaneously chased after the werewolf, each wanting to take revenge on him for the irrevocable death of their comrades in arms. Mike asked his skeletons to stop for a while so that the werewolf could replenish his strength, and also offered to kill his comrades to save his life. Without a second's hesitation, the werewolf was already standing with a pistol in his hands and put it to his friend's head and fired the fatal shot. Then, using several knives, he simply slaughtered some of his friends like pigs and received enormous pleasure from the work he had done. But he didn't stop there. He took the initiative to tie his hands behind his back and led him to the wall, where he killed him in cold blood. Even the skeletons, who had seen all the abominations and torments of hell, were horrified by his craving for maniacal murders in a cruel form. They seemed like babies in comparison to him. They could not let this animal remain alive and pounced on it with the whole crowd, just to trample it with their bones, not leaving even a hair of it. At that moment, another group of werewolf monsters came to him, who had no idea that their comrade had cold-bloodedly killed his own to save his life, and handed him an elixir of health. The werewolf began to greedily drink this elixir in order to recover and continue the fight with renewed strength. Having regained his strength, he began to threaten our heroes with bravado, hinting that they now had automatic weapons, from whose shots no one would have time to hide. Mike understood that now their forces were not equal, but he would never retreat from his goal, even at the cost of his life, which could not be said about his cowardly friend Johnny. A group of werewolves arrived on the side of the werewolves, wearing tactical gear and weapons, making it clear that they had no choice but to surrender. The werewolves began to shoot in one stream. It seemed that there was no place in space where a bullet did not fly. Despite this, the skeletons, like the gladiators of ancient Rome, set out on their final journey. They were not afraid of death. They were already dead. The bullets pierced their bones, got stuck in them or crashed into the wall. Many died, but they could not be broken. They continued to fight. The werewolf trembled with fear. No one understood what was happening. Our hero used another of his magical techniques, and a bright light poured out of his hand, accompanied by unnatural and scary sounds reminiscent of the crying of wild animals. The zombies entered the battle with the werewolves, completely subordinate to the will of their new master. Mike pointed them in the direction of the battlefield, and they shouted powerful cries indicating the determination of their intentions. Screams, pain, torment, dirt, blood, shots. Everything was mixed up. A real meat grinder began. The blood grumbled. The crunch of bones was heard in different corners of the world. It was a powerful confrontation between two otherworldly forces. The machine gun did not stop firing for a second. Everyone died on both sides. The ammunition ran out, the battle turned into hand-to-hand combat, and the enemies were strangled with bare hands. The concentration of powerful energies caused an explosion, which killed almost all the opposing sides. Only that daring werewolf took cover. It turns out that it was Mike who used his supernatural power. He simply burned everything around, so that there would be no trace of this evil spirit left. The werewolf managed to escape from this trap. He was followed by his faithful girlfriend, who was ready to sacrifice her life for his. They went up to the second floor and tried to open any door to hide from our hero, but it didn't end there. The skeletons turned out to be more resilient than all the living and began to grab the handrail to get away from the site of the explosion. One by one they rose and followed the scent of the werewolf. In their skulls there was only one thought of the task: to kill the werewolf. The werewolf and his girlfriend heard a loud knock on the wall. They realized that their hiding place had been found. There were only a few seconds left and the wall would collapse. The skeletons broke through the wall and joyfully watched the werewolves, who had gone mad with fear, in anticipation of victory. They began to threaten to use weapons, but they realized that there were more skeletons than they had left. The girl was the first to approach the skeletons and opened fire furiously in the hopes of killing as many skeletons as possible. In 1 second, a precise blow was delivered. The werewolf girl's head was torn off and, having already separated from her body, continued to scream with rage. The werewolf never expected to see this terrible sight, because she was once his wife, and he himself turned her into a werewolf. The skeletons played with the head like a ball and threw it towards the werewolf, indicating that his head would fly next. He began to run away cowardly. His former arrogance was gone. He only dreamed of getting away from here. Realizing that he was trapped, the werewolf looked at everyone with a bestial gaze and began to threaten them, demanding a personal duel with Mike. Mike, in his usual manner, did not even resist. He only asked him to change his underwear before this, since the smell of his courage had spread throughout the entire room. Suddenly, a friend of the werewolf appeared. He miraculously managed to escape. He threw him a pistol. The skeleton lunged at him with a sword, as he wanted the werewolf to be able to use the gun and kill their new master. The werewolf, like the last time, began to shout battle cries and attacked the other skeletons. He wanted to die courageously. The skeleton did not expect such actions from the werewolf and missed one fatal blow. Mike invited his loyal servants to stop and invite the werewolf to come to him for a talk, as he had proven himself to be a fearless warrior. The skeletons were outraged by the new order of the master. They did not want to stop halfway and give the werewolf a chance to stay alive. The skeletons, like zombies, not understanding the order of their new master, moved towards the werewolves. Mike did not understand what happened to them. It turned out that it was the werewolf who was still alive, who had managed to plant a weapon to kill their master the day before. Now Mike understood what had happened. He didn't have time to turn to face them before the sharp blade of a sword pierced his heart. He fell dead. The skeletons were pleased with themselves. Mike became wary. It was time to take control. Otherwise, the skeletons would not leave a single witness who would tell where to look for their leaders involved in the death of his mother. He used his supernatural powers again. A bright glow enveloped the entire room. The skeletons froze in their movements. They surrounded Mike and, like loyal but evil dogs, waited for further commands from their master. But their black insides did not allow them to calm down right away. One of the skeletons asked Mike to shoot the werewolf with a bow, just to wound him so he couldn't run away. He pulled the bowstring of the crossbow and fired one aim shot. He was pleased with himself because in his past life he was an archer. The arrow pierced the werewolf's left side into the kidney, and because of this wild pain, he will not be able to move independently until he drinks the elixir of health. Then the skeleton shaman began to cast spells over his body that would help him speak the truth and only the truth. He further lifted his head and applied it to his old and shabby robe. Now he would be sincere with our hero. After which he gave him a discharge of energy like a powerful electric current to bring him to consciousness and continue the conversation. The werewolf lay on a pile of stones. He was no longer studying that insolence and arrogance, cynicism and contempt for our hero. He was simply living out his seconds of life. His face was haggard, blood was pouring from his mouth. He seemed like just an ordinary guy who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that's the kindness werewolves always radiate in their hour of doom. Mike asked one question, where his leaders could be found, but the werewolf chose death and refused to talk. In an instant, a sharp sword pierced his body. He groaned in pain, but still did not reveal the location of his leaders. Mike gave him one last try to tell him everything, and he promised to save his disgusting life, but only he would continue it under his complete control. Our hero thought that this werewolf was indeed a brave guy, and it would be better if he were his assistant instead of the cowardly Johnny. But the choice was his. The werewolf began to cry that he really didn't know the whereabouts of his bosses. They always communicated impersonally. He never saw them in person. They only communicated through social networks. They did not believe him and continued to torture him. The skeletons in these areas of work showed particular zeal. It seemed that no one could withstand their pressure and offensive actions in extracting the testimony of interest. Even Mike began to shudder from the horrible images he saw. Cold sweat began to run down his back. He even felt sorry for this werewolf for a moment. He just wanted to shoot him and end his suffering. The loyal skeletons began to pierce his body with sharp spears and swords. But the wounds did not hit vital organs so that he would not die until he told the whole truth. Our character realized that nothing would work out with him, that this werewolf would rather die a painful death than give up his patrons, which means he is very afraid of them. He is just a pawn in this group. The werewolf was lying on the ruins of the floor slabs. He continued to moan. It seemed that one more, maximum 2 breaths and he would die. But he suddenly said that they should look for them in New York in a nightclub and did not have time to finish its name. He began to acquire a bestial face. These were the last convulsions before inevitable death and movement into the dimension of dead werewolves. Our hero realized that this was only the beginning of his hunt. This werewolf is the lowest link in this hierarchy of werewolves. He has a big, but very important and interesting job ahead of him. Mike looked at the lifeless face again. Now he seemed like an ordinary guy from Washington. One could become friends with him. But the werewolves ruined his life. The hero leaned over and looked intently into his eyes. The last minutes of his life were scrolling through them. In them he saw him as a cheerful and loving husband. But these creatures bit him. Mike turned around and wanted to just leave, but remembered that he had to remove all traces of these terrible murders, and asked the skeletons to clean up the room before the police arrived. The skeleton lifted the body of that werewolf again, and once again plunged the silver stake into his heart. From this blow he convulsively opened his mouth again, then dragged him into the common pit with the corpses. Mike thought again. If it weren't for his principles, he would have been a good helper in finding these creatures of the underworld. But he could still be respected. He didn't give up his comrades. His body lay apart from the rest of the torn werewolf bodies, his head slumped on his chest. Mike thought that maybe we would meet again in the dimension of dead werewolves, and he would work for me. Mike's thoughts were interrupted by the cowardly Johnny. He began to worry again that it was time for them to get out of this place. The sounds of police car sirens could already be heard. The skeletons did their job wonderfully. They set the entire building on fire, and there won't be even a trace left of this bloody massacre. Mike and Johnny got into their car. They had a long road ahead of them. What awaited them in another city was unknown, but they knew it was time to move. Johnny asked our hero if he had managed to find out another location of these non-humans, and he himself thought how good it was that they had killed them all, since no one would say that he had chickened out and had not immediately told Mike about them. Our hero's answer shocked Mike. He said that he already knew everything, he could read minds, but he forgave Johnny. But he warned that he would never forgive betrayal. Johnny tried to object, but his excuses only made his already bad situation worse. His new friend tried to explain that he was really scared and wanted to tell everything, but then this guy showed up, and otherwise he would have told everything, of course. He felt very ashamed. He even offered to kill him if our hero wanted it. Mike paused. He barely heard him. He was replaying the werewolf's last words in his head. He was already making a new plan for the search. Then he became distracted and asked Johnny to repeat his words again, apologizing for not listening to him carefully. Realizing what Johnny was offering, the hero even mentally agreed to his proposal. But the ghost of the murdered werewolf appeared in Mike's mind and indicated that he would still be useful to him and would prove his loyalty. He reassured Johnny and explained that he was still simply very young and that wisdom would come with age, and that he completely forgave him for his cowardice. They moved along the night highway towards new and dangerous adventures, the noise of the engine calming their brave hearts. At this time, in one of the nightclubs in New York, information spread about the mass murder of their Washington cell, which was responsible for the supply of young and beautiful girls. The enraged boss was tearing his accomplices apart, asking why he was learning all this from the pages of the tabloids and not from them themselves, and how this could have happened at all. One of the werewolves said that there is rumored to be a werewolf bounty hunter in America, and this is most likely his doing, but preliminary police data indicates an accident. The boss wondered if maybe this was all arranged this way and planned by their superiors, since they began to become very independent and allowed impudence in communicating with their elders. His right hand suggested that it was time to take control into his own hands and write these old men off to shore. But Boss Bobby didn't think so. He understood that there were very serious people behind their leadership, so the mass murder of their unit was staged as a death in a fire. He pressed the elevator button and suggested going down to the bar to have a whiskey and think it over again. Then he suggested to his companion that he should go himself and bring a bottle of champagne and invite some nice new girls from the last batch of their dead friends. He looked around the room. It seemed to him that there was a strange presence in it, but most likely it was nerves. They had never dealt with members of their group so brazenly. He decided to read what they were writing about this incident on closed werewolf social networks. It contained CCTV footage, in which he saw the full content of these murders. He was horrified and could not contain his emotions. He realized that it was definitely not a fire. In the photographs, he saw an image of our heroes, who were already being sought by all the secret agents of the werewolves. When they read that they were being hunted by a famous werewolf bounty hunter, they simply started screaming hysterically in fear of death. All bravado suddenly disappeared, after which he realized from the surveillance cameras that our characters were already standing at the threshold of their premises. The New York werewolves began to discuss their plan of action to neutralize and destroy our heroes. Their thoughts were confused and constantly changing. They were confused. One of them suggested leaving the nightclub and leaving a few new werewolves in the premises for show, who were not particularly useful to them. The boss thought and, crossing his arms on his chest, could not answer for a long time. He was thinking. His closest aide advised him to ambush them and slaughter them like pigs, so that everyone would know that their group was not to be messed with. The youngest of them, a werewolf, cowardly suggested calling the police, but he was resolutely refused. Then he asked to test his abilities, which they often resorted to in case of serious danger. They allowed them to move in space. He touched the floor with his hand for a long time, but nothing really worked. This strong excitement prevented him from concentrating his strength and energy flows. The young werewolf finally threw up his hands and explained that nothing was working. He suggested going to the kitchen for sharp objects, and also informing the elders in advance about the werewolf hunter's visit. Sharpening the knives took a little time. He checked their edge and was satisfied. He always dreamed of distinguishing himself on the battlefield, to remove the label of a little boy. All the knives were sharpened and ready to be taken to your guys for some fun. The rest of the gang members were excited by the sight of the knives. They were already anticipating the smell of blood and the taste of fresh meat. The boss gave one of the knives to his junior, and he would have to use it to cut our hero's throat. They became noticeably more cheerful. They had already forgotten that only yesterday their cell was cold-bloodedly and professionally killed in its entirety. They carelessly expected to win. The boss handed out knives to everyone and ordered no one to surrender, and that they would present the blood of these uninvited guests as a gift to their elders that evening. Everyone took their places, surrounding the perimeter of the front door, their hearts pounding faster, adrenaline giving them strength. Mike, as always, calmly entered the room and walked straight into the circle formed by the werewolves. They surrounded him from all sides. Mike offered them to surrender immediately, and then he would allow them to die quickly. Johnny, in his usual manner, broke out in a cold sweat of fear. He knew that a serious battle was ahead. The werewolves began to threaten our hero with bullying and excruciating torture for his insolence. The boss suggested that our hero take off his pants and turn his back to him so that he could record a video of them taking down the most fearsome werewolf thug. Mike offered to spare their lives in exchange for information about the location of their leadership. Although he thought to himself that the promise to the werewolves could not be fulfilled, death awaited everyone anyway. The boss lit a cigarette and decided to play a double game with him. Agree and deliver him alive to the werewolf headquarters. Mike read his mind and pointed out that he couldn't wait long, otherwise everyone would be destroyed. His eyes were bloodshot. Only Johnny understood that now the loyal and very terrible servants of our hero would arrive in the earthly dimension. A moment later, 100 skeletons stood behind Mike, eager to deal with these stupid werewolves. The gang of werewolves did not expect such a development of events and silently cursed all their members who suggested setting up an ambush for them. Mike gave all the actions to his loyal skeletons. They could do whatever they wanted, but he had to get the information he was interested in from them. The skeletons decided to use their secret abilities that blind werewolves. The youngest werewolf was the first to go blind, and his pants began to emit a foul odor from fear. All the others were blinded one after another. It seemed as if they would never see the white light again. The skeletons increased their spells. They examined the memories of all werewolves for information about their handlers and high bosses. Only Boss Bobby did not succumb to their hypnosis and tried to disenchant his gang members. The skeletons realized that it was time to end this sentimentality and just cut them up. Blood splashed in all directions, hearts were torn out of their chests. The main werewolf was among the first to be killed. His dreams were not to come true. After which, as a deterrent, they began to cut off his head so that the others could see what awaited them. Mike watched everything from the sidelines. He was pleased to know that he would soon get to the leaders. It is worth noting that at this time, on the other side of the city, the rest of this group was relaxing peacefully. Lights were on everywhere in the windows. They were enjoying the evening and did not even guess what had happened. The rest of the werewolf gang played poker and discussed their current affairs involving the distribution of drugs throughout America. Their peaceful evening was interrupted by a loud knock on the door. They thought it was the police, but they did not understand why, since they systematically paid tribute to the city police leadership. But it turned out to be their torn boss. His wounds were large and blood was flowing from them. He miraculously got out of that trap, but his appearance did not inspire confidence that he would be able to live any longer. He described in detail what happened, how they were attacked by a werewolf bounty hunter. With him was also his assistant from among the werewolves, as well as demonic skeletons. After which he was unable to continue the conversation, as his body began to bubble and it seemed that he would soon burst into flames. This is how Mike's magical energy worked. Hearing these terrible details, the werewolves became hysterical. There was a powerful explosion, which tore the werewolf's body into small pieces, and his piercing scream rang in my ears for a long time. Then he simply turned into a bright flame and disappeared forever, his soul moving to the realm of dead werewolves. It was already deep night, but the lights were on in the house on Wall Street. The senior werewolves were already aware of what had happened. They could not sleep. Jack nervously smoked and listened to his fighters. He was tormented by the thought that perhaps their clan was being eliminated by competitors who wanted to control their entire business. Then his life was in danger. His charges nervously told the latest news, trying to protect themselves in this story as heroes who, not sparing their lives, bravely fought against their enemy. They convinced their boss that they really couldn't do anything, since our hero had caught them by surprise. The element of surprise had played a cruel joke. Their leader could not stand it and told them that they should have died then too, and that they were just cowards who managed to hide. The second question tormented Jack even more. Who would now be engaged in the production of amphetamine, since the best chemists had died, and their product was in demand all over the world? His associates thought seriously they were bound by contracts, and the deadline for producing the next batch of drugs was approaching. One of them timidly offered his services, although he did not fully know the algorithm of actions. But the main thing is that he assured his boss that he wanted to save his life. Then, a dispute arose between them regarding the candidacy for the position of senior werewolf leader who had died that night. One of them began to reproach the other, saying that he was not even capable of putting children in their place at school, but wanted to apply for this position. The second one argued that he had an analytical mind, and that his bravado was the reason the rest of the clan died. The argument turned into a continuous swearing and mutual insults. No one wanted to give in to anyone. Suddenly, One of them indicated that if he did not withdraw his candidacy at the general meeting of the Supreme Werewolves, then he would tell everyone the compromising information about him. After that, his face changed. Fear settled in his eyes. He understood that this information could completely turn his situation upside down, slide into the very abyss. The second interlocutor was relentless. He continued to press him and give detailed circumstances of his cooperation with vampires. From these words, his eyes rolled back. His pupils seemed to disappear. He understood that his whole life was in the hands of his companion. He immediately changed his manner and rhetoric of communication, began to try to change the subject of conversation, but he was not particularly successful. He lit a cigarette nervously. He wanted to tear his interlocutor apart, but he understood that he was now dependent on him. At one point, he realized that he would turn this dirt in his favor if he reported it first and presented that the guy was trying to slander him in order to remove him as a candidate for boss. He said these words on speakerphone on purpose, so that the other person would understand that his cunning plan had failed. This made the guy feel sick and he almost choked on his cigarette. At the end of the telephone conversation, he explained that he would deal with his competitor as the werewolf law dictated, which meant that his life was now on the line. The broken interlocutor began to beg for mercy, swearing by the god of werewolves that he would not tell anyone how he had noticed him collaborating with vampires. But it was too late. The said werewolf used his magic, the secrets of which were passed on to him by his beloved grandmother. Now nothing threatens him, but we will find out what kind of betrayal awaits the werewolf leadership. The disfigured and dead bodies of the werewolves who had incriminating information lay on the ground near the car of our main characters. Johnny started taking pictures of them for the report, and Mike had a very interesting idea that should help in finding the leaders of the clans and the top of the werewolves. He began trying to revive one of those killed werewolves in order to offer him to work for him and thus take revenge on his killers who betrayed him. But this is a procedure of very strong energy and concentration. At the moment of the ritual, Johnny began to worry. This could only mean that they were in danger. Mike was absorbed in the ritual and did not react in any way, so Johnny decided to contact the police. He reported where they were, the exact coordinates, and counted on help. However, he realized that the police were working for the werewolves, and he only made things worse. And now, all the nearest outfits and members of the werewolf clans would be heading after them. Mike continued to try to revive the werewolf, but the process took a long time, at which time Johnny realized that they were in great danger. The werewolf lay in the same position, his facial expressions had not changed. This could only mean that it was not possible to return him to the human world. Mike didn't want to give up on this idea because it could help him a lot, especially since he would have good motivation to work for him. Johnny looked at the body of this werewolf in confusion and said that they had figured out their location. It turns out that you can't trust law enforcement in this city. Mike's faithful friend, who always helped him in difficult situations, came to his aid from the other world. Mike realized that everything would work out. His eyes glowed red with joy. The main thing was to get everything done before the uninvited guests arrived. The main skeleton turned to our hero and pointed out that he smelled trouble. And now the main thing was to concentrate his forces on overcoming all the dangers. The skeleton began to perform a voodoo ritual, which repeatedly helped him revive various animals. But with a werewolf, it will be more difficult. He is neither a man nor an animal. The werewolf was still lying motionless next to our hero's car. Mike began to remember his teacher. He knew all the spells. He would have helped him a lot now, but the werewolves killed him during the last battle. His mind was filled with vivid memories of where he spent a long time after his mother's death, his second home, where he met his teacher, his mentor. The main skeleton began to look into the halo of the all-seeing eye to find out the reason why it was impossible to revive that werewolf. He explained that his soul is at the very bottom of the dimension of dead werewolves. He was killed by ritual death as a traitor. But he is not one. He was set up, but nothing can be changed. Mike realized that his ideas were not destined to come true, but this gave him even more strength to move forward towards his goal and achieve victory. Suddenly, members of the werewolf clan appeared through the portal. They had automatic weapons with them, and they were determined. Then there was a bright flash of fire that blinded our heroes for a while. From the very center of the flames emerged the new boss of the New York Werewolves with his close associates. The thirst for revenge could be seen in their eyes. The boss offered them to surrender and follow them quietly. Then he would guarantee their safety and a hearing at a general meeting of elders. Mike responded with a firm refusal, making it clear that he would never accept their offer, but would rather die here and now. In support of these words, the chief skeleton of the underworld promised them hellish torments for this insolence and suggested that they report the location of their elders before it was too late. Our hero began to concentrate his powers. He understood that he had previously spent a lot of them on resurrecting the dead, and had not yet had time to fully recover. Mike's initial appearance caused laughter among these werewolves, accompanied by offensive and humiliating words addressed to the hero and his team. A powerful explosion came from right under the ground, the shockwave of which sent all the werewolves flying in different directions. But the werewolves continued to actively fight. They used their weapons, which could kill our hero's assistants. The werewolf managed to inflict fatal wounds on several skeletons. It turned out that he was an excellent marksman, perhaps even a prize winner in shooting competitions. However, in an instant his body was pierced through and through by the skeleton's sword, from whose blow no one had ever managed to remain alive. Mike decided to intervene and not drag out this battle, but used his magical gift of directed combustion and with the snap of his fingers caused a fire. The flames engulfed all the werewolves and skeletons in seconds, and the fire didn't just burn, but twisted into a spiral, preventing anyone from escaping the fate of becoming a burnt corpse. The werewolf boss howled in pain, but the aggressive environment did not allow him to take the form of a beast. He dreamed of the onset of darkness. Mike was pleased with himself. He could finally relax and just enjoy watching his enemies say goodbye to life. The skeletons asked our hero to put out the fire. They also wanted to participate in the destruction of these monsters. They called upon their indefinable and magical energy. Johnny became worried because as a result of the cessation of fire, the werewolves became stronger, were able to instantly recover and continue the fight, which means they were under the influence of the elixir. They tried to get up, some of them succeeded, but the skeletons knew their business well and used their strength to smash these monsters back. They cut off their limbs and heads. This particular cruelty had developed in them in their past lives, when they had suffered at the hands of werewolves. The werewolf boss was able to put out the fire and take control of it. Now he too had similar powers to our main character. He was even able to kill one of the skeletons with this flame. He was again triumphant and reveled in his combat achievements. Johnny pointed out to Mike that the skeletons were gathered in a single line, which made him suspicious that they were going to attack or retreat as a crowd, as they were afraid of the fire energy. Mike explained that this was a reserve and they were waiting for his command, but so far there was no such need, while the skeletons had the upper hand. They simply skewered the bodies of werewolves one after another, like meat on a skewer, their terrible screams thundering throughout the entire outskirts of the city. The boss began to realize that his men were almost exhausted. Only a few remained, which caused him death throes and particular rage. He gathered all his energy into a fist. It seemed that a little more and the sun would form in his hands. He was preparing to deliver a crushing counterattack. However, his plans were not destined to come true. The nimble skeleton cut off his hand with one instant blow of its bone, and all his new strength instantly disappeared. Only the severed hand emitted powerful streams of energy, which moved chaotically in different directions. He fell and was enveloped in moving flames that burned with a bright light, creating the illusion of a double body. Our hero's legs instinctively moved forward, as he always wanted to take a closer look at the body of a slain enemy. Mike stood motionless, still surrounded by an aura that was gradually fading. He wanted to finish him off with torture. The werewolf boss began to try to get up, but his legs wouldn't hold him up. He understood that he had miscalculated his enemy, but it was too late. He had already begun to see the ghosts of his dead friends, who were calling him to the dimension of dead werewolves. He was at Mike's feet. He didn't even have the strength to stand up. He was practically kneeling in front of our hero. The boss asked to kill him quickly. It was his last request. Mike initially thought that he should beat the information out of him first, but he knew that the clan leaders would rather choose a painful death. He made a sign with his hand, and the skeleton instantly plunged a sword into his heart. Blood gushed from his mouth. He began to wheeze and gradually went limp. The skeletons turned to their elder. They reported to him about their successes, as well as the number of wounded and killed. Mike watched the bleeding corpse of this werewolf with a feeling of complete satisfaction. He understood that he was one step closer to his cherished dream. Suddenly, a clot of bright energy formed near them. No one understood what to expect from this phenomenon, and everyone became wary. A young man began to emerge from the tongues of blue flame. He was wearing high lace-up boots, which gave his image a mysterious look. This was the werewolf that our hero had been trying to revive for so long, and in his hands was a dried-up tree branch with skulls strung on the stems. The werewolf who returned from the other world thanked his new master for giving him life. It turned out that the magic spells worked. Johnny looked at our hero's new comrade in surprise. He even felt out of place and wanted to object to his presence, but remained silent. Mike began to check his possible setup and asked him to remember his close relatives. since real werewolves lose their memory of their past life. It turned out that this werewolf could transmit his thoughts to our hero. He saw his father and brothers, and realized that these abilities would be useful for his team. The werewolf's face changed significantly and became very kind. He introduced himself as Christopher, and he was very grateful to our hero. Then he exclaimed that the defeated werewolf had to be killed again, otherwise the elders would resurrect him. He was of great benefit to their community. He even asked to pay attention to the white pupils of his eyes. This meant that he could be revived by giving him the blood of a virgin to drink, which our heroes did not want. He raised his skull staff high, casting spells, and a glowing aura formed around the magical item. Then he grabbed the werewolf's head by the hair and continued his prayer. The energy began to concentrate in his staff, and he dealt several blows to the werewolf's body, causing him to start moving convulsively. The ritual did not end there, and the stems of the staff began to penetrate into the body of the werewolf boss to damage every internal organ. He started screaming, making strange sounds similar to growling. The branches of the staff gouged out his eyes. Now he will definitely never return to the human world. Johnny was afraid that this fate could await him too, especially since he does not have any supernatural abilities and our hero can get rid of him, since he is a werewolf. The stems of the staff continued to suck energy from the body of the werewolf clan boss, and he gradually turned to ashes. Upon completion of the ritual, a new skull appeared on the staff, indicating that his ghost was now inside the staff in complete and permanent confinement. Johnny watched everything carefully, and suddenly, instead of skulls, he saw the heads of defeated and killed werewolves, which shocked him. He even saw their bodies. He realized that this revived werewolf was a real sorcerer, and he should not be trusted too much. All that was left of the werewolf boss's body was decayed, thin skin. On the staff of the werewolf sorcerer, instead of skulls, human heads appeared. They tried to say something important, but could not open their mouths. Then their new assistant, the sorcerer, explained that the heads were telling them to hide for a while in another city. Otherwise, they would all die. And all the forces of the elders were thrown into the place of their battle. The heads on the staff suggested that they move to Washington, where no one would be waiting for them and they could hide in a safe house. The sorcerer began to quickly rotate the staff. It was enveloped in bright energy, which, like a teleporter, moved them to the above-mentioned city. They found themselves right in the room of the couple in love. Their house was a little closer. The sorcerer said to himself that he had entered the coordinates a little incorrectly. The beautiful and young girl was shocked by what she saw. Her boyfriend laughed in surprise. Something had to be done, because they could call the police and then the werewolves would quickly find them. The sorcerer cast a spell and they all disappeared. The agitated couple couldn't come to their senses for a long time, and eventually they decided that the extra glass of champagne was to blame. Finally, they found their home. They were already waiting there because Mike's loyal friends, with whom he was in Washington, had been waiting for them there for a long time. Their friends were very excited. They waited for Mike in this apartment for almost a month. "Why didn't you see our note, where we should meet again? This world is seething with danger. There are werewolves at every step." The next day, Mike had to go to work. In this dimension, he is the head of a large company, and so that no one would guess, he must fulfill this role. Already early in the morning, our hero was in his large office. He recalled the recent battles with werewolves. He wanted to go further into battle, but he had to bide his time. He understood that if he continued his active search, he would be exposed to those around him. Mike pressed the button to call the staff. He didn't know his team at all. He wanted to call a general meeting and at the same time get to know everyone. A young guy opened the office door and asked the reason for the call. The real boss of the company was a real tyrant and had never communicated with him, so this call surprised him greatly. Mike explained that he needed to gather the entire team of managers and key specialists, and also provide a list of employees with photographs. The hero understood that he was simply in the body of the head of this company, and his words caused surprise. Apparently, the real boss was not distinguished by generosity, but only showed a commanding tone. The guy said he would do everything, but he had never gathered a team on this day before. Everyone would not be ready to report on the work done. Mike demanded to follow his instructions, and not to reason. The hero had to simply dissolve into the human environment. There is a big hunt for him. And our character also asked to see the police report of incidents. He wanted to see what the police were working on now. After all, in just a few days he left behind many corpses. While waiting, the ghost of a teacher appeared to him, who did not want Mike to continue the dangerous search for werewolves in earthly civilization. He addressed him directly and warned him that there was nothing but deception around him and that no one could be trusted here. His life was in great danger. Mike thought about his mentor's words for a long time, but the desire for revenge did not stop him, despite all the upcoming dangers to his life. His power revealed that there was a werewolf working in his company's economics department. He was a threat to him and needed to be dealt with first. Our hero has finally decided that he will not leave human civilization until he destroys all werewolves, and most importantly, their top brass, who were involved in the death of his mother. He turned and went to the window. He always thought better when he looked at nature, but here there was concrete and people all around, but it was still beautiful. The hero came up with the idea that in the course of communicating with his subordinates, he would identify the city's key officials, who must have information about the top werewolves. The meeting began. Everyone listened attentively to our hero. Before the said planning meeting, he had managed to understand that his company was engaged in construction, and over the last quarter, a decline in financial indicators had been noted. The head of the construction department spoke first. He explained that production volumes had fallen, there were not enough construction sites, and that competitors had reduced prices for construction and installation work. Mike listened to him intently and did not want to interrupt his interlocutor, but he already understood the true reason for the drop in indicators. Our hero brought up the fact that the head of the department has been receiving money from competitors for a long time for providing commercial secrets and the cost of construction projects. Everyone was shocked by what they heard. Their boss never allowed himself to accuse his subordinates of a crime. The team's opinion was divided. The majority did not agree with their boss's statement. So Mike suggested that everyone express their opinion and introduce themselves in full, so that he would understand the names of his subordinates. Each person introduced themselves in turn and justified their point of view. Mike was pleased with himself. He understood that he was already tired, and he was beginning to be tormented by the ghosts of his murdered friends, who died in an unequal battle with werewolves in all dimensions of our universe. Then he felt alone, enveloped in a black spell, perhaps a precursor to his imminent death. His thoughts returned to the meeting again. The team was already discussing the second issue related to the forecast export figures. Mike remembered that in order to increase exports, it is necessary to expand the geography of deliveries. He immediately remembered the Chinese village where he often spent his summers with his teacher and studied martial arts. The head of the department suggested going on a business trip to Canada to sign new contracts. Mike was still nostalgic for the Chinese landscapes and did not listen to his subordinates at all. He again saw the ghosts of his murdered friends. They wanted to warn him about something. Mike detachedly agreed with the opinion of his subordinates, which caused the team to suspect the mental health of their boss. Previously, he only shouted and imposed his decision. The hero said that he had to go to another city for a while, and his deputy would temporarily perform his duties. He did not want to waste time on this boring work. He already imagined himself in another dimension, where new adventures awaited him. The team became alarmed by the inappropriate behavior of their leader. But as soon as he personally insulted and humiliated everyone, they calmed down and began to fulfill their duties. While he was away at meetings, his friends had time to have fun and kill many monsters. However, his younger student was seriously injured and was on the verge of death, requiring emergency medical attention. He held onto the walls of the room and walked towards the exit to get some fresh air and stop the bleeding with improvised means. The skeletons methodically finished off the wounded werewolves. There was a wild scream and the smell of death around this house. One of the werewolves pretended to be dead and managed to fool the skeletons. Now he was trying to get out of the room. He felt for the radio with his hand and wanted to call for help from the other members of the werewolf clan, or at least send the coordinates of his location. However, he was unlucky, as the radio's battery died and he only discovered himself. His girlfriend, who was hiding behind him, was pulled out by the hair with all her might. From the wild pain, she began to moan and beg for help. The werewolf realized that he was not destined to get out alive. His blood was flowing all over his body. He was going to die anyway. The skeleton noticed him and cold-bloodedly finished off the wounded werewolf, indicating to our hero that the entire room was cleared. All the werewolves were dead. Mike walked proudly towards that werewolf. He wanted to get information from him about the location of the werewolf headquarters. The werewolf agreed to help him in exchange for sparing the life of his girlfriend, who had just been dragged into the next room. Mike thought for a long time whether to agree or not, but in any case he had nothing to lose, since by saving her life he would learn more. The werewolf started from afar, that their leadership is practically unknown to anyone. They communicate personally only through their first deputies. One of these deputies is in Chicago. He can be found in the best casino in the city. He is its owner. After finishing his words, He began to ask for mercy for himself, although he understood that this decision would not be made. Mike thought that this werewolf could be useful to him. At least he would show him the way to this casino. The werewolf even became more cheerful, realizing that he could save his life and assure our hero of his devotion. Mike knew that his words couldn't be trusted, but he could be played with and get more information. His new sorcerer apprentice also confirmed his reasoning that this werewolf cannot be trusted. Even the spirits of the staff claim this. The werewolf calmed down and continued to tell that this city has professional security and it would not be possible to simply kill this werewolf. He looked at his bloody pants and realized that his body was catastrophically short of blood. He would not survive without a bite from a new person. The werewolf, staggering in pain, stood up and walked towards the exit. His thoughts were only about a new portion of fresh blood. It seemed to him that no one even noticed him. How he left unnoticed? Only the sorcerer understood everything and watched him. The werewolf decided to look into the cabinet, which was in the pantry. He smelled blood there and could not do anything with himself. His legs did not obey him, and they themselves went in his direction. Disappointment awaited him. There was nothing in the locker except documentation, and the smell of blood remained due to the storage of a human corpse in it. He looked at the people's files. These biographies and personal data seemed very familiar to him, but he could not remember where he knew them from. They were photographs of young people, but they reminded him of people he had known when they were older. They were definitely werewolves. Mike was once again convinced that these people were werewolves in their youth who were involved in the murder of his mother, which means this werewolf is lying, and he personally knows the most important link in this tangled hierarchy. The werewolf understood that he had completely deciphered himself, but he could not afford to give away his main bosses, since in this case the death of all his relatives and friends awaited him. The werewolf sorcerer tried to hack his consciousness and see pictures of meeting places with these bosses, but there was a strong block. His attempts were unsuccessful. Mike leafed through the diary again, bitterly recalled his childhood and wanted to give him life in exchange for any hint. However, the werewolf sorcerer had already cut off his head. The hero began to suspect that he had done it on purpose so that he could not find out more information. His headless body lay at the feet of the sorcerer, who assured Mike that with his power he would show him the right way, and the werewolf had already told him everything he knew. He ran his staff over his body and another skull appeared on the branches. He locked it in his dungeon. Johnny was in despair. His older brother had just been killed. He was literally a couple of minutes short of saving his life. He looked at his body and wanted to cry from grief. But he held himself back because he did not want to show his sympathy for werewolves. As a keepsake, he decided to take off his wristwatch, which his mother had once given him for his birthday. Johnny was glad that they remained in good condition after such a battle and could remind him of a close relative. He turned to Mike and pointed out that they knew the direction of the search and there was no time to waste. Then he saw a news channel that showed Mike in a recording as the director of a large construction company. He was shown in close-up and is now easy to spot, as his identity has been established and he needs to urgently change his place of residence. The hero realized that this cover had played a stupid joke on him. Now everyone in Washington knows him. It only remains to add that he is wanted on suspicion of murder. Mike decided that his role as the company's director was over. Although he changed his appearance when he came to work, it is so similar that the chances of continuing to hide behind this legend are zero. Maybe he should just move to a smaller company. The hero imagined himself as a small boss, but immediately abandoned this idea. While the hero was reasoning, the city was already seething with news that made ordinary people break out in a cold sweat. Mike was counting the possible options for getting to Chicago unnoticed on public transportation. But already on all the advertising screens of the city, his image was broadcast as the face of a person wanted in hundreds of murders of ordinary people. The news in question caused acute fear among all the residents of this large city. However, Mike understood that money and power decide everything in this earthly world, and he could relax and work out a route to Chicago. This time, Johnny wanted to protect his new owner from rash actions. An ambush could await him in Chicago. The hero continued to study the werewolf diary. He learned that they are behind all the werewolf clans and lead this criminal community. They control the entire criminal business of America. Johnny continued to convince them that their new assistant had deliberately cut off that werewolf's head so that he wouldn't have time to finish the details, and that their new assistant was playing a double game with them. Reading the werewolf diary fascinated Mike. He did not hear anyone and was lost in his thoughts about the past. It was impossible to reach him. He saw familiar faces in this notebook and realized that for a long period of time he had been surrounded by two-faced assistants who only confused the tracks leading to the top of the werewolves. These assistants were so close to him that they reported to the werewolves about all his plans and intentions, which is why they always suffered great losses and his teacher died. Mike realized that there were always traitors around him and now he couldn't trust anyone. But he didn't want to stop halfway. Johnny started shouting and begging him to stop and not go to Chicago alone. The city was simply teeming with werewolves. The hero was unwavering in his plans and did not want to listen to other people's opinions, especially since he no longer trusted anyone. He understood that he could not cope alone, but he could not give up. His assistant watched him go, and the realization that our hero could die made him feel very sad and tears began to flow from his eyes. He stood in the middle of the room where the torn bodies of werewolves were scattered. He didn't know what to do, but he had to get out of this place quickly. He didn't want to come to terms with the thought that he saw Mike for the last time. His heart was torn out of his chest. He decided that he would definitely follow him, even to the ends of the earth. Mike also understood that, although Johnny was a coward, they got into all the ambushes together, and they could have both died together. He could not work for werewolves. He took his watch out of his pocket and looked at the time. It was already late, but he could still have time to warn Mike that he was in real danger. They could already be waiting for him on the street. He frantically grabbed his mobile phone and started calling our hero, but he didn't answer the calls, and then the phone switched off completely. Johnny started calling the werewolf sorcerer, but he calmly replied that he couldn't change anything and that he'd better think about his own life. Now he finally understood that the werewolves had played a trick on Mike and had deliberately planted this diary on him so that he would stop trusting anyone and be left alone with them. This means that he must definitely be killed in the near future. Since they have completely removed their masks and opened up, they need to control him more, and they decided to eliminate him. He even saw Mike's corpse lying in a pool of blood, his exhausted body motionless. He followed our hero. Johnny decided to save Mike at any cost, and if it doesn't work out, then it's better for them to die together. He went outside. There was no one in sight. This city resembled a concrete jungle. He felt sick, his throat was dry, and he couldn't even shout to call Mike. Mike walked to the bus stop with the skeleton. He was deaf and dumb and could easily be followed to Chicago. He would not be able to pass on information to anyone about his plans. At this time, our hero was already in the sights of the binoculars of professional killers who were already waiting for him to exit the building. Mike realized he was being watched, but he didn't give it any importance. He was so desperate about the betrayal of his assistants that he couldn't make rational decisions. The killers confirmed the mission over the radio once again, and his elimination was confirmed. The killer's partner, using optics, once again confirmed Mike's identity and pointed out that our hero was indeed walking into the range of their weapons. The second killer took out his sniper rifle and began loading the magazine, inserted a round into the rifle barrel, and prepared to take an aimed shot straight into Mike's heart. A shot was fired. Our hero's aura began to turn bloody. His eyes turned red, and this could mean the worst. Mike's mind began to flash back to vivid moments of his life. The images changed one after another. He saw himself full of strength and energy when he first entered into a deadly battle, as usually happens before death. It is unknown whether Johnny will be able to help him.